Good morning, everyone, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to another episode of Logos Live. I'm very, very happy to be here today with John Barclay, John M.G. Barclay, who is professor, Lightfoot Professor of Divinity at Durham University. And John, I believe you've held that chair for 20 years. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah, that's right. I moved to Durham in 2003. I followed Jimmy Dunn, James Dunn, my predecessor, and I was in Glasgow before then, but I moved to Durham for this chair in 2003.
Jimmy Dunn's quite an act to follow.
Yes.
But what a wonderful man he is. I think I had coffee with him and his wife at SBL in Boston a few years ago, and it was just really a delightful experience. What was it like stepping into Jimmy's chair?
Well, it was a bit daunting. He had followed C.K. Barrett, so there was quite a tradition of New Testament scholarship here to inherit. But Jimmy was very gracious to me, never kind of put his oar in or tried to direct what I did. And he was a great conversation partner for the years that he still lived in Durham. I used to see him quite a lot. But I was privileged to build on the foundations he'd laid. He and Kingsley Barrett before him had made this a great center for studies of the New Testament, and particularly of Paul. I didn't always agree with everything that Jimmy said, but he always took disagreement well. He never took it personally. So it's been a privilege to be here, to be supervising a lot of PhD students like yourself, and to be teaching here for the last 20 years.
Wow, it's quite a legacy that's been there in Durham. I know when you were there and when I was there for just a few years, it wasn't just Jimmy Dunn, and C.K. Barrett was still around, I believe, but also Cranfield was in town.
Yes, exactly. Yes,
yeah.
Yes. That was quite an extraordinary. Yes, and Cranfield lived till he was 98, I think, and Kingsley Barrett till he was 96. Sadly, Jimmy Dunn moved away from Durham and then sadly passed away 3 years ago, in the first year of COVID. But there was a buzz about the place, and is a buzz about the place, and we were well connected internationally to Germany through Tübingen and to America through so many students coming from there and going back there. And it's been a center, an international center with students from China and other parts of Asia, from Latin America, from other parts of Europe, and so on. And India. So it's been a rich environment. It is a rich environment in which to work.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I certainly experienced that when I was there, and I think one of the hardest things I've had to do in my adult life was move away from Durham. That was hard, but necessary. Yeah. Speaking of your time at Durham, so you've been supervising PhD students for a number of years. Yeah. I think in a recent conversation you and I had, you said that that's maybe winding down soon.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you don't mind, I just want to read off just a few of the names, and please fill me in if I forget. But it's been a really interesting legacy you've left through individuals such as Jonathan Linebaugh, Joey Dodson, Katie Hockey, Jeanette Pfeiffer, or Jeanette Hagan at the time, Todd Still, Dave Briones, Eddie Adams, Dorothy Berchman, who was there when I was there, Stephen Chester, Robbie Griggs, John Goodrich, Ben Blackwell. I mean, the list goes on. And what's interesting about all the names I read is that these people have gone on to do quite some interesting and significant work in their own right. And yet they studied under you. And for many of them, it was these comparisons of, say, Paul with another Jewish interlocutor or some other system of theology that was perhaps non-Christian. And we see that in your what many have considered your magnum opus, the Paul and the Gift. So the question I've wanted to ask you for some time actually is, what sort of effect did it have on you as a scholar supervising students who were doing this comparative type of work? How did that feed into your eventual massive 600-page, changing book on Paul?
Well, it's been a great privilege for me to supervise so many students. In that list you gave, I think Jerry Dobson, I didn't actually supervise
Sorry, Joey.
all the rest I did. It's been a privilege for me because I've learned so much from my PhD students, and they've always brought something to me that I didn't have before, and pushed me. And it's been a kind of collaborative exercise. I always see this relationship between supervisor and student as not a one-way relationship, but something in which there's mutual benefit. And I've long felt that in order to say something fresh about Paul, or indeed any New Testament author, we do need to bring resources from elsewhere, not resources that will, as it were, frame or constrain what we can say about Paul, or any part of the New Testament, but resources that can help open up good, fresh questions about the text that we're trying to get our head deep into. I think probably we're at a stage in scholarship where so much has been said on so many fields in New Testament studies that we continually need to refresh the field. And one of the ways I've always enjoyed doing so, because I love reading primary text. I just love getting my nose close to a text and getting my head deep into its modes of thought. So one of the ways I've always enjoyed is putting texts in conversation with one another, dialogue between different texts, and whether that's from the Greco-Roman world or whether that's from the Jewish world, contemporary text or text from the ancient world that can make us look at things a little differently, to ask slightly different questions, and then if those are good questions that are appropriate to bring into comparison with Paul, or whatever else we're studying, they can really help pose different questions than have been raised before, and sometimes that helps us see things we haven't seen before.
Yeah, if I could press you further on that line of thinking. What's interesting about your career, John, to me at least, is you haven't done that many commentaries. Whereas some, I won't say any names, but some scholars who are, of course, highly respected are known for their commentary work.
Yeah.
However, one of your, in my opinion, greatest contributions outside of Paul and the Gift is your commentary on Josephus, published with Brill. What did you glean or gain or learn from Josephus that then contributed to, I wouldn't say your insights into Paul, but rather your ability to ask questions of Paul?
Yes, my work on Josephus arose out of a long project on Diaspora Judaism, and because I was convinced that the nearest analog, as it were, to those Pauline churches that were being founded by Paul across the Greco-Roman world, the nearest analogy were the synagogues of diaspora Jews. So I worked on that for a while, and then of all the texts I read for that, the primary text I read for that, the one that interested me most, and that I thought there was still a lot to be said about, was Josephus's apologetic work against Appium. I think what that helped me see was get a better appreciation of Judaism in the ancient world, of its strengths and its vulnerabilities, of the ways in which it understood community formation, because Josephus has a very, very interesting analysis of the main, what he considers the main points of Judaism, its main features and its main convictions and practices. And although he's writing 30 or 40 years after Paul, it's near enough contemporary to give us a really good sense of how Jews understood themselves. And I think Paul is, of course, a Jew as well. So these are two Jews speaking at a roughly contemporary time. And it helped me see what really mattered for being a Jew in the Greek and Roman world in terms of religious commitment, in terms of social commitments. And I think the ways in which Josephus imagines this community is built around ethnic identity with its strong historical roots and the practices that constituted that ethnic identity. That helped focus for me the ways in which communities operate, not just in ideas, but in practices passed down through generations. And the things that he focuses on there in terms of marriage and meals and distinctive Jewish practices of worship and so on, and the ways he has to defend those, but also clarifies what they mean. That really helped me as I tried to think about what Paul was doing in founding new communities in the Greek world, what kind of basis they were on, in what sense they crossed ethnic boundaries, and what were the difficulties in crossing boundaries. So yeah, I loved working on that. It was a text on which there had been no commentary ever written before, or at least only a partial one written more than 100 years before I wrote mine. So that was kind of like, oh, this is virgin territory. This is fresh ground, and which is difficult. Well, you can't do that with any biblical book now, can you? So
no.
It was exciting to say something new because nobody had done what I tried to do there before. Yeah.
So Logos is used by a lot of people who are very interested in the biblical languages. And I'm sure a question that might be arising for them right now is, what was the Greek of Against Apion like? And did it require you to resort much to the lexicons and other resources to get deep into it?
Well, most of it's in Greek, but there's one part of it of which we don't have the Greek. We only have a Latin translation, actually. So it stretched both my Greek and my Latin. I was fortunate in that before I did theology, I studied Greek and Latin literature and classics. I did my first part of my undergraduate degree at Cambridge in classics, and that was building on many years of studying Greek and Latin at school. So I was really, really extraordinarily fortunate, privileged in having a sort of strong linguistic basis. So the New Testament is relatively easy Greek as far as ancient forms of Greek go. Josephus was sometimes a stretch, and sometimes actually at one or two places really incomprehensible because the text is probably corrupt. But yes, I also discovered how difficult it is to translate. It's the first attempt I'd ever made to offer a translation. And I realized I went back and back over it again and again, because every time I looked at it, what I'd done, I thought this isn't quite satisfactory. And I realized I now have a great sympathy for Bible translators, because I realized what an impossible job they have. There is no perfect translation. Everything you do, it seems like the nuance is not quite right, but it's impossible to find an exact translation. That was stretching for me, very stimulating. Yeah.
So let's talk about your early study then. I'm sure there are lots of Bible scholars and pastors, ministers who wish they had studied the classics, just to get that firm grounding in the languages. But from discussions you and I have had, it wasn't exactly planned out by you to study Greek and Latin all those years for the sake of becoming a Bible scholar.
No.
But I've heard some of this story, but if you could just talk a bit about the decision you had to make between becoming a Bible scholar versus going into more of a missions, into the missions field, as it were.
Sure. So between school and university, I went for 6 months to work in a church in Pakistan, in Lahore, in Pakistan. I don't think I did anything very useful there, but I learned a lot. I learned a lot from my experience there, and it was my first experience of working in the majority world, and face to face with wealth inequalities and depths of poverty that I'd never encountered before. So it was a rich but also quite a challenging experience. I came back to the UK and started my degree in classics, and had a struggle to really match up my experience of the world in Pakistan with my work in classics. What exactly has Homer to do with the beggars that I was passing on the street every day as I walked to work in Lahore? So I thought I had the opportunity to switch degree halfway through, which is not possible nowadays, but it was possible then. And I switched to theology, hoping that theology might actually be a subject I could put to use and in that kind of context. So I initially thought I would finish my degree and then travel again to India or Pakistan and maybe look to work in a seminary or something there. I realized then I really needed a PhD in order to do that kind of work. And as I did my PhD, I began to feel my vocation changing, and with encouragement from others, and just by watching how academia works, I began to feel maybe my vocation was more in the academic life than in serving the church in a different environment. I've always thought the key thing is for everybody to discern as far as they can their vocation, and that's to do with their skills and the gifts that they've been given, but also to do with what doors open and what doors don't open. I felt that what gifts I had were best used in the context of teaching and of research and scholarship. And I thought, well, I'll knock on some doors and see if something opens in that connection. I've always seen what I do is in the service of the church, but I've never been called to church ordination in any denomination or to serving in a parish or whatever. I'm a member of a church in our local parish, but I'm not a minister. So everybody has a different path. I don't think there's a right path here, but I think it's a question of discerning as far as you can what talents and gifts you have and where they're best deployed. And where they're best deployed is, I think, comes about as you knock on various doors and try various options and see what God opens up.
That's a good word. I know that for myself, someone who went into seminary initially thinking I was going to be a pastor, is then got encouragement to continue on with my studies, had an incredible time under your direction and leadership, thinking I was going to go into academia, and then coming out and doing something church related, but not as a minister, not as a biblical scholar proper. And that's just where the Lord had me go. And I did resist at various points, as I'm sure you did as well, just because of a lack of information. We don't know the future, and we just kind of deal with the cards that we've been dealt, as it were. So yeah, that's a good word. Now, what's interesting though is that here, so many years later, you've caused the entire church global, as it were, to rethink or reassess the perhaps most fundamental aspect of what we call Christianity or our faith, and that is the concept of grace, charis. And have you reflected much on that? I mean, we'll get into the nuts and bolts of Paul and the gift and so forth, but have you reflected much on the impact? And now, of course, with the smaller version of your or more concise, I would say, Paul and the Power of Grace. But have you reflected much on that, or have other people come to you and made you aware of the impact you've had on the church with this?
Yes, I have. And in fact, I've just come back from a week in Ethiopia where I was lecturing on grace there in the Ethiopian Graduate School of Theology, which was wonderful and wonderfully stimulating experience for me. And I reflected on that as I came back. I thought, here I decided to be an academic, but here I am, working in Africa in Ethiopia, trying to communicate, what I've learned through my academic studies. So I feel like it's taken a while for me to find, the theme that would be most valuable for the church, and to some extent I've been surprised that people have found it as valuable as they have. I mean, I wrote that big book for fellow academics, as it were, and then was rightly persuaded to boil it down into something a little bit more accessible in the smaller version, Paul and the Power of Grace. But I think it's I think it's the fruition, as it were, of a long time of thinking about this topic and thinking about it in connection with the church, though not specifically with, like, what am I going to say in Ethiopia or India or whatever. It's like, how can I think through this absolutely central topic? And then I've been surprised and delighted that people have found it helpful at all kinds of levels, at intellectual and church related levels, and at personal levels as well, because they've grappled again with this, as you say, the central concept in the gospel.
Mm. So for those who are listening who are perhaps uninitiated to your presentation in Paul and the Gift, can you just give a quick summary of what you're arguing for, but also concisely as possible? You speak as long as you wish, but on the six perfections.
Sure.
Where do we arrive after going through either of your books, understanding of grace?
Yeah. So what I tried to tease out the different ways in which grace has been understood and can be understood. We think of it as a simple concept, but actually it's a much more multifaceted concept than we think. One could think of we use the language of pure grace or free grace sometimes to mean a gift, the grace of God in Christ that's given to us without prior conditions. But sometimes we think of it in terms of the gift of God that's given first, the priority of grace before we respond to it, or sometimes we think of it in terms of a gift that doesn't have any elements of circularity, no strings attached, as we sometimes say. And I realized as I worked on this that we come with very different expectations, actually, of what we mean by this word grace. It's a word we can all agree is central to the Christian message, but we actually have quite different understandings of the term. So part of what I've tried to do in that book is tease out the different connotations of the word grace. And I've used the word perfection. Perfection is drawing out a concept to its end point, as it were, drawing out a notion to its to the nth degree. And I realized that in the history of Christianity and right up to today, some of the biggest debates, like the debate between Augustine and Pelagius, or the debates between the Reformers and their Catholic opponents, or the debates today between the New Perspective or Barthian reading of Paul, or apocalyptic reading of Paul, or whatever, the debates in scholarship as well as the debates in the church have often centered on or been affected by really quite different understandings of this word grace. And I drew out what I call 6 different perfections of grace. I perhaps don't need to go into all the details of but the key element for me was to say the radical cutting edge of Paul's theology was that God's grace is given without regard for considerations of worth. That's in the absence of worth and regard for worth. And worth defined not only in terms of moral worth, but also in terms of social worth or gender or status worth. And for me, what's important about this is that this is the engine that drives and the foundation on which you can build these communities that cross categories, that cross ethnic boundaries, that cross the differences of status between slave and free, or between male and female. So because God's gift, God's grace is given what I call incongruously, that is to say, without fit or without match to the worth of its recipient. That, which is familiar to us in the Protestant tradition, that notion of the amazing grace that saved a wretch like me, is not just about the wretch like me, the individual, although that's crucially important. It's also about the ability to form communities that cross boundaries, the communities of radical difference, because we're all brought into the sphere of grace without regard to any prior consideration. That's a very unusual notion of the grace or the gift of God in the ancient world, and it's still counterintuitive for us. We look for the ways, there must be some rationale why God gives gifts to some and not to others, but for Paul, this is the radical edge of his theology. But the second thing that was really important for me as I worked on this is to say that the gift of God is unconditioned in that sense, let's say given without prior condition. We should not confuse that with the notion that it comes, with the notion that it's free in the sense of and expecting no response or looking for no, if you like, return. So often when we've talked about the free gift of God, the free grace of God, we've said, oh, it's unconditional, both in the sense without prior merit or worth, but also in the sense like, and of course, it lays no obligations upon us. And I'm saying, no, I think that second part is wrong. I think the way Paul spells out the implication of what he says, living under grace, is predicated on the expectation that the gift of God in Christ does have expectations, because it is transformative. Not because God lays new obligations on us in our old state, but the grace of God, because it's about creating a relationship between us and Christ, putting us, as Paul would say, in Christ, and bringing us into the sphere of the Spirit. It changes us, and that change results in a change of behavior and disposition and expectations and practices, and everything to do with our relationships with God and with others. So what I think people have found helpful about that is it avoids the notion of what Bonhoeffer called cheap grace. That's to say, grace is a gift that's given, and then, well, you can do what you like with it. It's a gift, surely you can do what you like with it. Or that, well, God will always forgive you, so just go ahead and don't worry about obligations or don't worry about changes in behavior. And I'm saying, no, it is to use a slightly dangerous language, I've said it's an unconditioned gift, but it's not unconditional if we mean by that expecting no response or no return. I know that's dangerous language of which to walk on, but I think Paul is quite clear that this is meant to be a transformative, this experience of grace is transformative, because at the end of the day, grace is not a thing, it's a relationship. It's bringing us into, by God's favor and blessing, bringing us into the power sphere and the transformative life of the Spirit, and that will have all kinds of radical consequences and change in our lives.
Thank you for that. It seems that the emphasis on the Spirit is so important because, well, you've mentioned these key words such as relationship and transformation, community. When we think about a term like cheap grace, it boil down to just, well, God just forgives you and then off you go.
Yeah.
But that's so transactional versus relational. And it seems as though the Spirit is required in, well, of course it is, but of course the Spirit is so required in what you're presenting. Like there cannot be this transformation, there cannot be this creation of these communities, which perhaps is not even what Paul set out to do. I wanted to ask you about that.
Mm-hmm.
I think Paul intended to create communities. Was he, as some have said, well, he was really trying to change Judaism from within. That's why he went to the synagogues first. Or did this just start happening along the way and Paul saw it for what it was?
Well, I think he always intended to create relationships. That's to say, it was never just about individuals, because Paul doesn't have the modern concept of the isolated, self-sufficient individual. For him, we're always related to others. We're related to God positively or negatively, but we're also related to one another positively or negatively. You know, the alternative is, well, either you benefit one another or you destroy one another. There is no option of just, well, maybe I'll just live on my own and have my own individual relationship with God. That isn't possible, because we're built into we're built for sociality. We're built for one another. We're built for interdependence, as the notion of the body of Christ indicates. So that at that level, like, does Paul expect there to be relationships of people rather than just individuals? Yes, absolutely. It's about relationships. Did he expect these relationships between believers to differentiate themselves, or to be differentiated from the Jewish tradition, from Jewish communities? I think you could say, well, both yes and no. I don't think he intended to create something, that we call Christianity, but he was very conscious that those who belong to Christ have their highest allegiance to Christ above every other form of allegiance, including ethnic allegiances. And therefore, that would involve relationships between Jews and non-Jews that were going to strain some of the taken for granted cultural assumptions of his Jewish heritage. And this is where, going back to what we were talking about, with Josephus and the way he figures the Jewish communities, he says, well, we Jews can associate with other people. Of course, we're not unfriendly. We associate up to a point, but when it becomes the really central parts of life, like marriage and sharing meals, then of course we have to maintain our distinctions. That's what it is to be Jewish. And what I find fascinating is that Paul, is prepared to transgress some of those boundaries, because your allegiance, as he puts it, is to your common Lord, and that will mean that there are different cultural traditions within the community of Christians. So I think there is a kind of inner logic by which the relationships of believers that Paul creates begin to separate from the mainstream Jewish communities. Not that there's a kind of strategy there to, I must make new communities, but by the logic of what he does and how he speaks about what he does, there's a kind of inevitability, I think, that these new communities, these new relationships among believers will put some strain on the boundaries of the Jewish community.
So can we build on that concept of community a bit? Because as you and I have talked very briefly about some of the new work that you're doing now, which deals, to put it very simply, with the vertical aspects of grace. If Paul in the gift was dealing, the horizontal. if Paul in the Gift was dealing with the vertical aspect of our relationship with God in this, well, the circularity of it, the reciprocity element that apparently has been missing from some systems of theology on grace. The recent work you're doing now, which I don't think has been published in book form, is that correct? Perhaps in journal articles, but all that to say, now you're looking at, okay, how does this schema function on the communal level, on the horizontal level between those individuals who have been transformed and have been called to reciprocate that gift? How can you talk about the interplay of that vertical and horizontal aspects, the vertical and horizontal of grace as you say, I'm losing the term now, unconditioned,
Right.
Yet not unconditional.
I think, as I say, for Paul, the self is always a relational self. So you're going to thrive in community and in relationship across difference and not just sameness. And he sees as you can see from what he says about the collection project, for instance, he sees the grace of God as given in order to be passed along, to be passed forward, as it were, and or paid forward, and that generosity of spirit as well as material generosity, that expression of love that radiates out across the community as the community is soaked in and wrapped up into the self-giving love of God. That will take practical expression in all kinds of ways. The vertical and the horizontal are not, two alternative dimensions, really, in the sense that for Paul they're part of the same thing, two sides of the same coin, if you like, because the communal, the community is built out of the gifts it receives from God, and the gifts it gives to one another, it also at the same time offers back to God. So you don't either give yourself to God or you give yourself to the community. You give yourself to God by giving yourself to the community, as it were. So these are two dimensions of the same thing. And I'm exploring at the moment the circulation of grace in the sense of how these communities are given a framework for understanding their mutual dependence and their mutual benefit, so that it's not I'm pushing back against notions of charity or love as top down and one way, which is the way we think about charity mostly nowadays, or philanthropy, or that's the rich giving to the poor. It's top down, and it's only one way, because I wouldn't want to receive back from you. Surely the purest gift is if I just give to you and I get nothing back in return. And I'm saying I think those are both wrong ways to understand Paul's notion of community, which is not about top-down giving. It's about people at more or less the same economic level, which is a level of great vulnerability in the ancient world, supporting one another, bearing one another's burdens, as Paul puts it. Not the rich bearing the burdens of the poor, but all more or less likewise poor, bearing one another's burdens. So I'm looking at the economic aspects of this, where to place these communities on the social scale, and how to understand their economic relations with one another. But I'm also looking at the ways in which all dimensions of this community, not just material, but also other forms of mutual giving, are, as I say, not one way, but reciprocated. The hospitality given is also matched by a hospitality received. The gifts given are also the gifts received. Sometimes I think in the Christian tradition we found it easier to give than to receive. And I think, as Paul's vision of the body suggests, everyone has to say, "I have need of you." Everyone is in need, as well as having gifts to share with others.
Yeah.
And so I'm challenging some modern notions of altruism, which set off a kind of alternative. Either I benefit from this, which is selfishness, or you benefit from this, which is selflessness. And I'm saying I don't think those are the two alternatives that Paul plays with. Certainly he's not in terms of selfishness, but the alternative to that is not selflessness in the sense that I have no benefit from what I share with you, because sharing is about the sharing of the self with, and that means there is, I think, mutual benefit. So I'm kind of exploring notions of shared benefit, of co-interest, if you like, of how a community can be formed in which everybody flourishes, and it's not about sacrifice of myself for the sake of the other, but it's about ways in which we can flourish together.
These notions of altruism that all of us are familiar with in the modern world, this idea of the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing.
Right.
You know, you're so blind and willfully so to any sense of return.
Right.
It's so ingrained in us. And it seems like the effort that you're making to push back, you know, being rooted in the biblical text, feels like something that the church should and must and hopefully will embrace. I wonder, though, two things from that is, number one, in your research, are you drawing upon other Christian or non voices in philosophy or economics that are informing this research of yours? And number two, the follow-on to that would be, what impact could the church have if they were to embrace what you're teaching?
Yes, that's a big question. I mean, there's been a really interesting set of analyses of where the modern notions of altruism have come from, and which is very much influenced by Western notions of individualism and the desire to be self-sufficient and to be independent. And so I'm drawing on a sort of history of critique of those of philosophical analysis and critique of some of the Western concepts here. I'm theologically close to people like Sam Wells and others who are looking at the importance of the preposition with, or God with us with the other, working and giving with the poor, not for the poor, but with. There's been a long, quite well, maybe not long, but there's been a decent history of critique of aid projects, for instance, that you know come in and give for others and therefore disempower the recipients or humiliate them even, and don't enable reciprocity on principle, but actually end up with quite problematic power relations being established by doing. So books like Toxic Charity, for instance, which you know emphasize how charity can be very, very damaging in its effects. So I think what I'm exploring will, to some extent, capture a sense that we need to move away from modern notions of individual autonomy and modern power dynamics, in which the giver is always situated above the recipient, in which and if the church thinks of itself as sort of Lady Bountiful, always able to give for and to others, it ironically separates itself from others. So the ways churches have been involved in community organizing, the way churches have been involved in neighborhoods, of taking positions of real vulnerability as well as real contribution. And that's created a thickness of communal relationships. It wouldn't be possible if the church was somewhat standoffish in its self-sufficiency. So these are, I think there's a number of thinkers I'm aligning with here, philosophical and theological and practical, really, about how to make the best difference, which is the hard road of actually being involved with people and not just chucking money from a distance and from a height on people. Yeah,
it's an interesting point you just made, because as many of us have heard, whether it's how accurate it is, I won't make a judgment at this point, but that a lot of the ancient world wasn't so interested in helping others out, and then Christianity comes along and says, well, no, like, we're going to do this, we're going to set up hospitals and orphanages and feed people.
Yeah.
And then that eventually that gets kind of taken over by government institutions, and the church kind of loses a big part of its purpose.
Yeah.
And then here we are today where, we don't really need to be generous anymore. We can kind of turn that generosity inwards and I'm just speculating, but build a bigger church building, or pay more staff, or send it to missions organizations. What impact then, like, what should the church be doing according to the model that you're proposing?
Right. Well, I think one of the one of the distinctive things about early Christianity was not so much that it was willing to give, because the giving went on within small circles of friends and families, and has always done so. The difference was extending that circle and taking the risk of giving even when you're not sure it's going to be reciprocated. So taking the risk of giving outside of the circle of the safe and of people like you. So that outward turning of the church created relationships, which I think one reason actually why the church grew so fast, because it created relationships with people outside of their own circle in a way that drew the attention of people to the message that Christianity was about. And I think,
if I could just interject real quick, because I want to clarify something here. So the turning outwards, did it move incrementally, say, from families to other families within, so from family to church and then to outside world?
Yeah, I think so. I think,
Okay.
I think it, as Paul says, do good to all. He says, especially the household of faith, but he's already said to all. And that willingness to, bless your enemies, to pray for those who persecute you, even those hostile to you, because the grace of God is unconditioned, and therefore it goes to all without them having to be like you in the first instance. That meant that the Christians were quickly known to be not just a little clique supporting each other, but a church which had the desire to bless, to save, to heal, to assist people even outside of their own circle. So that sort of centrifugal dynamic, which comes from the dynamic of the gospel, really, that God entered into a world hostile to God's self and to save it, and the Christian church then finds itself propelled outwards. And that meant that in a play, Christians would pray for and help people outside of the church, as Cyprian says, or as Christians were often commented on people who sought peace and who sought the welfare of others even beyond their own circle. So I think it's that extension of the kind of mutual self-support that went on in smaller circles in the ancient world everywhere, where farmers helped each other out and family helped each other out. And so on. Everybody's in that kind of, well, we're all here to help one another because we can't survive without it. But when you extend that in the Christian church to people, to strangers, to neighbors who are not like you, to people who've you can't be sure they will reciprocate. And that's the risk that Christians take. They don't know if this relationship will be returned. But that creates this outward dynamic. And I think what worries me is that as the church in the contemporary world, as the church becomes less powerful across society, can become more sectarian and more cliquish in a sense. Like we look after our own, but we leave somebody else to look after everybody else, as it were, the government or some other philanthropic body. And I think where churches will thrive is when they refuse that kind of inward turning, and they take seriously the locations in which they exist, their neighborhoods, and they become vulnerable to and open to engagement with all types of people, and not just those who turn up on a Sunday morning, because they have a calling to express the grace of God in all kinds of relationship. Yeah.
Interesting words you just used there about risk and vulnerability, that we often hear in the context of economics or geopolitical issues.
Yeah.
And yet within the context of the church, I think here in the United States in particular, we have maybe set ourselves on a more insular trajectory, protect ourselves.
Right.
There's these forces, ideological and otherwise, out there that we need to, steer away from. But this is going the other direction, not at the corruption of our doctrine or of our relationship with God, but rather enacting the reciprocity, this, as you say, the incongruous circularity of grace.
Yes, I think I think there are going to be increasing fractures in our society. We're losing the ability to communicate across boundaries and across differences of view, and the danger is we all huddle together in our little worlds of like-minded people, like us in terms of our culture, our upbringing, our race, our political point of view, and inhabit different worlds. And I think there's something really significant pushing against that in the gospel. Not, as you say, to abandon the gospel, but precisely because the gospel impels us to engage across difference with people other than ourselves, to bring the grace of God to where we might think it's unfitting or unlikely to succeed, because that's where we take the same risk that God took in the incarnation, the risk of coming into a world other and alienated from God in order to share our experience and to save us. So I think that same dynamic is constantly looking, wherever there are boundaries, is constantly looking to cross them, where the barriers, to take them down and to reach beyond out of our comfort zone, really, which or too easily retreat into our comfort zone, don't we?
And with that, we've come full circle to your decision on going into missions or not. Just as you're talking, I think, I don't know why, but what came to mind is Hudson Taylor heading off into the complete unknown, but compelled to take, the gift of grace, as it were, into the darkness, the spiritual darkness. I wanted to ask you this earlier and I forgot, but was your attraction to missions partly driven by the Cambridge 7? I mean,
Yes,
you were at Cambridge. Yeah,
exactly. And we had prayer meetings in the Henry Martin Hall, and we knew these missionary greats, as it were, CT Stud, people like that. Actually, I think one of the things that made its deepest impression on me in Pakistan, though, was not what I gave so much as what I received, because I used to go every week on the back of a motorbike of the Pakistani padre of this church I worked in, to what was called the Basti areas of Lahore, which are the poorest parts of Lahore, mud brick houses, And
Yeah.
because most Christians in Pakistan are of what's called the sweeper class, which is the bottom social category of society. And these little meetings in which I was asked to speak, and Padre Mirage used to translate for me, but they made a huge impression on me, because the faith and the persistence and resilience of these very, very poor Christians, who were, as I say, despised by the rest of the population, and their you might say simple, but I think very profound, faith in Christ in those living conditions. That blew me away. And I remember going back to Cambridge and I think I've seen more profound and more authentic faith in the Bastis of Lahore than I've seen in these privileged, colleges in Cambridge. And that's lived with me, right through. Just don't get wound up or tied up or over impressed by the kind of the ways in which academia always likes to think it's superior or somehow better. I think real authentic Christian faith can be expressed in all kinds of ways. And so I think it's that sense of going into the world not just to give but also to receive and to learn.
Yeah.
And that is part of the vulnerability. Yeah.
Mm. Okay, so just a few questions to close. Is for those interested in getting into your work, I would assume that Paul and the Power of Grace is a good place.
Yes.
For an entry point.
Yes.
Where would you tell people to go next? I would say at some point you need to read Paul and the Gift, but where else? I remember when I was considering doing doctoral work in the UK, a friend of mine sent me, Preston Sprinkle actually, he sent me a few articles of yours that have been published probably in New Testament studies or something.
Right.
But where would you send people to start kind of exploring your work? Well,
I think probably the best at the moment is for those who are not, kind of at the kind of research academic level. Probably the best place would be to say, take a look at Paul and the Power of Grace. But I think if people feel they want the kind of the hardcore scholarly version of that, then Paul and the Gift will expands on that and takes it deeper. But it's peppered with a bit of Greek and Hebrew and so on. So it's not for everybody. I recognize that, and that's absolutely fine. I've got a number of pieces of work more recently. Studies in Christian ethics. I've got a piece on self-sacrifice or not self-sacrifice, just exploring some of the things I've just been talking about. But hopefully I'm going to finish this next book in the next couple of years or so, and that will follow up from what I've been saying today, and will follow up the next stage of my work on gift and grace. Yeah.
All right, so last question. And just a word of encouragement to everyone listening. When I first read John's articles that Preston sent me, I had a very hard time. I was in seminary, and I was used to reading, well, let's just call it simpler fare. And reading your articles was a good initiation into, I would say, much more rigorous scalpel-like work in the biblical text. So highly valuable for any of you out there who are more academically minded. Last question, John, is if you could just give a word of encouragement to, in particular, the younger listeners who are considering perhaps going into academia, whether that's a master's degree or maybe even an undergrad theology degree, but they're trying to make this decision of how do I follow God's call on my life just to be a Christian, And is that meaning something further, such as going and getting advanced degrees? Ultimately, how can I best serve my family, my church, and my God?
It's a process of discernment, I think, isn't it, about our gifts and how they're best deployed. And the problem is, lots of people have lots of gifts, and therefore, it's which ones do we maximize, and which ones do we maximize less, I suppose. I think I think it's important to say that the academic life is not for everybody, and it's important to say that it's not a superior form of Christian life. It's not like, oh well, the more degrees you've got, the better the Christian you are. That's definitely not the case. If you have academic skills, and I think you need other people to be honest with you about that, and no doubt your teachers will be, and your friends and so on. But if you have academic skills, it's certainly worth seeing if there's a good avenue to explore those, because you can use your mind and your academic training for the good of lots of people. It's not so don't let, as people tell you, it's just a sort of selfish option, because it can be, but it needn't be. It could be of real benefit to lots of people. As I say, it's not like the be all and end all of the Christian life. And if that path doesn't open up, it must be because there's a better or a different path for you.
Yeah. John, this has been wonderful. You've given us a lot to chew on, lots of really interesting thinking about grace and its circularity and what that means in terms of both, well, for us as individuals, but also in community. And I just encourage everyone listening, go read Paul and the Power of Grace, and absolutely dive into Paul and the Gift if you get a chance. It's worth chewing on. It's worth thinking about. And John, I'm personally, I'm so appreciative of the time that you invested in me and my family, but also it's obvious your heart for the church. And I do hope and pray that the work you've done on grace really does change the church for good. We're always reforming in a way, right? And
yeah.
Hopefully this is your work is leading us towards more reformation in the sense of how we perceive of God's relationship with us and our relationship with others, both inside and outside the church. So thank you so much for giving us your time today.
You're most welcome. It's been a real pleasure to speak to you again, Tavis. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, everyone.